Good morning and welcome to the 14th meeting of the COVID-19 Committee. We have apologies for this meeting from Beatrice Wishart and Ross Greer, who are attending other parliamentary committees. I welcome Liam MacArthur to the meeting, who's a substitute for Beatrice Wishart, and Alison Johnston, who's a substitute for Ross Greer. The Parliament agreed changes to the committee's membership in the plenary session on Thursday, 20th of August, meaning that our former convener, Murdo Fraser, and colleague Adam Tompkins have moved on to take other parliamentary roles. I would like to put on record the committee's thanks to both Murdo and Adam for their valued contributions to the committee's work. I would also like to welcome to the committee our new members, Donald Cameron and Maurice Corey, and I'll invite them both to declare any relevant interests. First of all, Donald, do you have any registrable interest relevant to the committee's remit that you wish to declare?
I have no relevant interest to declare, Deputy Convener.
Thank you, Donald. Maurice, do you have any registrable interest relevant to the committee's remit that you wish to declare?
Deputy Convener, I have no interest to declare.
Thank you, Maurice. I will now turn to the next item on the agenda. And the next item on our agenda is the choice of convener. The Parliament has decided under motion S5M 21506 that the convener of the COVID-19 committee shall be a member of the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party. Could I invite either of our members from the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party to formally nominate an individual for the position of convener?
Deputy Convener, I wish to nominate Donald Cameron as the convener of the committee.
Thank you, Maurice. Do members agree to choose Donald Cameron as our convener? I'm seeing nodding and thumbs up, so the committee has indeed agreed to choose Donald Cameron as convener, and I congratulate Donald on his new appointment. I'm sure I speak for everyone on the committee when I say we're all looking forward to working with you. And with that, I now hand over to Donald to convene the rest of the meeting.
Good morning. Firstly, can I thank Monica for her kind words and also for convening the early part of this meeting, and to say that I greatly look forward to working with all members on this committee going forward and the clerking team as well. Thank you. We now turn to the substantive business on today's agenda. This morning we are taking evidence on the Scottish Government's second two-monthly report and first Freedom of Information report to the Scottish Parliament under the Coronavirus Acts, as well as two SSIs. Those SSIs are the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Scotland Amendment No. 11 Regulations 2020, SSI 2020/241, and the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Scotland Amendment No. 12 Regulations 2020, SSI 2020/251. I would like to welcome our witnesses to this meeting. We are joined by Michael Russell, MSP, Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, Europe and External Affairs. Mr. Russell is accompanied by supporting officials from the Scottish Government. Can I welcome to the meeting those people? Jerry Hendricks, head of the FOI unit, Pamela Wilkinson from the Coronavirus Legislation Coordination Reporting Team, and Rebecca White, Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Regulations Coordinator. Cabinet Secretary, first of all, can I invite you to make an opening statement, please?
Your appointment as convener of the committee. I understand this is the 14th meeting. This is the 9th occasion on which I've appeared in front of the committee. And I'm glad to be here again to have the opportunity to discuss with you a further two sets of amending regulations, which amend the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Scotland Regulations 2020, more commonly known as the Lockdown Regulations. On the 20th of August, the Scottish Government published an updated route map which gave further indication of the order in which we will carefully and gradually seek to implement additional changes in Phase 3. The First Minister announced the outcome of the 7th review of the restrictions and requirements set out in the principal regulations on the 20th of August. The outcome of that review and the assessment of the evidence was that it was still not appropriate to move to phase 4 of the route map to easing lockdown. Further review will take place on the 10th of September, that is a week tomorrow. The amending regulations to be discussed today give effect to aspects of phase 3 of easing lockdown, but also strengthen some of the rules and mitigations we have in place to keep the virus under control. The Scottish Government made amending regulations by way of made affirmative procedure on the 13th and the 21st of August. Those regulations entered into force on the 14th and 24th of August, and the plenary vote will take place in due course. The amending regulations make a number of adjustments to the principal regulations. These are to adjust areas where the decision to implement further aspects of phase 3 necessitates a change to the restrictions on businesses and individuals. These regulations have allowed bingo halls, amusement arcades, casinos, bowling alleys and fun fairs to reopen, allow organised outdoor activity to resume, and allow preparatory work, including rehearsals, to recommence in theatres and concert halls ahead of their full reopening later in the route map. The regulations also make changes to the principal regulations to put in place additional measures that are necessary to limit the spread of COVID-19. They mandate that specified hospitality settings must collect and record minimal contact data from visitors to their premises in support of contact tracing as part of the NHS's Test and Protect programme. There's also a requirement to provide this information on request to a public health officer, to support contact tracers to give appropriate public health advice to possible close contacts of individuals who have tested positive for COVID-19. As set out in the updated route map, there are some proposed changes in phase 3 where we have not yet set a date for when they will come into force. The next review of the regulations is, as I say, a week tomorrow, and the First Minister will provide an update to Parliament at that point. I'm also pleased to be able to talk today and to answer questions on the Scottish Government's second report on the Coronavirus Acts, which, in line with the requirements of the Scottish Acts and our commitment to also report on the provisions of the UK Act, was laid before Parliament and published on the 11th of August. Our second report covers the second reporting period under the legislation to the 31st of July. It includes reporting on the provisions under Part 1 of the Second Scottish Act for the first time, as well as SSIs made by Scottish ministers, where the main purpose relates to coronavirus. This excludes SSIs made by Scottish ministers under the First or Second Scottish Acts or the UK Act, as these are already being reported on. The second report also reflects the new duty in reporting that requires Scottish ministers to take account of information about the nature and the number of incidents of domestic abuse during each reporting period. We've reported on the status and operation of all powers under Part 1 of the First and Second Acts, and the powers of the UK Act for which the Scottish Parliament gave legislative consent. We also reported in more detail on a set of 22 provisions across the Scottish and UK Acts in our second report, which we judged at this time to be of most impact or of interest to the Parliament for other reasons. For these provisions, we have sought to provide detail over and above the reporting requirements set out in the Scottish Acts on the operation of the powers. Finally, while it is not the purpose of the session today to consider the future of the coronavirus legislation itself, I confirmed during my statement on the second report on the 11th of August our intention to lay regulations for Parliament to consider which would seek to extend the Scottish Coronavirus Acts from the 30th of September 2020 to the 31st of March 2021, and to also lay regulations to expire certain provisions within the legislation which were deemed to be no longer needed. These regulations were laid on Monday the 24th of August. I look forward to engaging further with the Parliament and the Committee on the matter of the proposed extension of the Acts in due course. I'm happy also to discuss, finally, Convener, the Freedom of Information report, which, as required by paragraph 12 of Schedule 4 to the Second Coronavirus Act, we laid before the Parliament on the 7th of August. I hope you found those comments helpful, and of course I look forward to answering.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for your helpful comments. I will now turn to questions, and if I may, begin by asking a preliminary question, and this is in relation to the restrictions imposed last night in the west of Scotland. I don't intend to get into the public health aspects of this, but purely to ask you whether there's any prospect of emergency legislation forthcoming on those restrictions, given that I think the First Minister described them as guidance as opposed to legislative action.
There would not be legislation as such, but there could be regulation that would be brought in. I think that matter is under discussion at the present moment. one of the regulations, or one of the orders that we're considering that has taken place in recent weeks, the Deputy First Minister signed an order that gave local authorities certain powers to close premises, and it may well be that regulation of that type may be required. But I took part in the SCORE meeting last night, in which these were discussed, and I have to say that there was clear support for it, across local authorities as well. So I think at the present moment, this is good practice and guidance that's taking place. But the First Minister, I'm sure, will update people today at First Minister's questions, and there'll be a chance, I think, to question her then.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. I'll move on to the report that we're here to consider. And the report I was going to ask you about was the Freedom of Information report. There's one aspect of it that struck me. It notes that approximately half of the staff in the Scottish Government's FOI unit have been redeployed to coronavirus critical roles. And my question is, what discussions has the government had with the Scottish Information Commissioner about this effect, the effect that might have, and the impact of coronavirus on its performance, and whether the reduction in staff has had an effect on the time taken to reply to FOI requests, for example?
Well, I think we said at the very outset that it would do, but I think we should ask the head of the FOI unit, who is here, Jerry Hendricks, to comment on that specifically, as he will have staffing responsibilities. Before I do so, Convener, can I just make the point that right across the Scottish Government, there has been a redeployment of staff, considerable redeployment of staff. I know in the areas for which I'm responsible, that many staff are still working on coronavirus issues, and some staff, of course, have worked on both their existing job and new tasks under coronavirus. So there has been a huge commitment from staff, and it's required that commitment usually when working from home. And I would be surprised if it was different in the FOI unit. But perhaps Jerry would like to, with your permission, give some information on that.
Yes, please, Mr. Hendricks, if you can help, that would help.
Yes, we have engaged with the Commissioner on a regular basis on what has happened in the government more generally, and with the FOI unit itself. So he is aware of the redeployment of staff that has happened. What we have done in the interim is we have retrenched to focus on delivering casework advice to people who are receiving requests. Because some of our trained case handlers have also been moved, we are finding that some people who have not been fully trained are now having to deal with FOI requests. So we are focusing on providing them with advice when they get requests. And we have also recently developed a tailored module that we plan to roll out to some people that takes them through the basics of responding to FOI requests. So we recognise that there has been an impact on our performance since the pandemic has affected the government so markedly. We're looking at steps that we can take to mitigate that as far as possible, and going forward, looking at how we can then recover from that.
I think, Convener, if I might just say, we do, Jerry is absolutely right to say that we are in no sense hiding the fact that there has been a deterioration in performance. We predicted that because of the difficulty that existed, and indeed the figures on that are given both in what you have and in a written answer to Neil Finlay, which from Graham Day.
I believe Annabel Ewing has a supplementary on this. Annabel, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you, Convener. Congratulations on your appointment. Yes, just on the issue of FOI, I think we had received an email this morning from an FOI well-known campaigner who referred to the sort of alarming confession that the Scottish Government had made that staff had been redeployed from the FOI unit. I think, as the Cabinet Secretary has rightly reminded us, indicate from the very outset that this was a very likely scenario. And I would just make the point, because I think that many of my constituents would wish me to do so, that whilst we're living through times where many of them cannot visit, for example, their loved ones without restriction, I think that their priority would be that we get through the pandemic as quickly as possible, and then we can get back to normal business vis-a-vis FOI and a whole host of other things. So I think it would be important just to reflect that view, Convener, on the part, I would imagine, of many people watching this morning's proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Mr. Russell, do you have any reflection on that?
Well, if I could just, I agree with Annabel. I mean, there's we have said from the beginning that there would be a pressure on staff, and there has been. But if I can just put this in context, FOI is very important. I've supported FOI all my political life, and I continue to support it. But it's not the only route by which information can be found. We've published almost 700 documents about coronavirus in Scotland. We publish transcripts of the FM statements, as well as videos of the briefings on YouTube, 7 days a week. Unlike the UK government, we publish daily data, weekly figures by health board area. Scottish Government statisticians have developed a data dashboard that provides summary information as well as detailed analysis across Scotland about health, indirect health, societal, economic impacts. There is a continuing process of parliamentary questions. There is a lot of information around there. That having been said, we want to honour our commitments under freedom of information. We accept what those commitments are, but I think, as Annabelle has indicated, there also has to be a sense of realism.
Thank you for that. My final question is on the number 11 regulations, which, as you'll be aware, require hospitality premises to collect information about visitors. Now, many of these premises, such as pubs, may not have experience of handling personal data on this scale. And I wondered if you could advise the committee what checks are being put in place to ensure that the data is being collected in the proper way and used for its intended purpose.
Well, it is quite clear. I'll ask Rebecca White to say a word or two about this in a moment, but it is quite clear that this is an unusual thing for premises to do, and some people are been doing it very well, and some people will require guidance and support in order to do it. The information is recorded only for the purpose of provision to public health officials. It cannot be used for any other purpose, and that is absolutely clear. Nor can it be used by the premises themselves to contact visitors or customers directly. So the regulations are very clear about what the data is for and what is required. And I think we're all seeing this now being done on the rare occasions that people are in. I was even at an exhibition the other day, very briefly, at which data was being taken. But in terms of the advice that exists, there's also advice on data protection, which is given and which is freely available. And of course, there is no shortage of information and advice. But perhaps Rebecca would like to just fill that out in terms of what we are doing and what we will continue to do. And we have made a commitment to keep this under review because it is absolutely essential that this is done and done properly.
Rebecca, could you help us, please?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah,
we can, yes.
Excellent. Sorry about that. Small technical difficulties. Yeah, just to sort of pick up on that point, where venues are collecting and retaining this data in line with the regulations, the entire structure of data handling in respect of GDPR applies to how they collect and use that data. And so any advice and support that is out there about how to do that would apply to what venues are doing with this data, and it's very clear what the purpose of the collection is and the processing of that information. I can check exactly what the more detailed hospitality guidance says about this particular set of issues and provide a fuller written response to the committee if that would be helpful. Given that this is such a kind of technical area, I don't want to give any impression of stuff that's happening that might not be exactly correct. But as far as I understand it, there is support, advice and guidance available to businesses to ensure that they are in line with their legal requirements under the regulations, but also that they are, as you would expect, protecting and sort of storing individuals' data in line with GDPR.
Well, if I could take you up on your kind offer to do that, that would be excellent. I think we would appreciate a report in that regard. Can I now turn to Monica Lennon for a question?
Thanks, Convener. I had a brief connection issue, but hopefully things will be okay for the next minute or so. So I missed some of Annabelle Young's question and answered, but this might be one for Jerry Hendricks or the Cabinet Secretary if he wishes. Just sticking with FOI, I just wonder, has the reduction in staffing caused a delay in the Scottish Government bringing forward a Section 5 order under the FOI legislation, which would have extended designation of bodies to include, for example, private care homes. And if that obviously delay has resulted, what are the plans to address that piece of work, given there was an extensive consultation last year?
I think Jerry should.
Yes,
it has not been a normal time, and therefore it has been difficult even to meet existing commitments, let alone additional commitments. But Jerry, no doubt, can address that.
Yes, thanks, Cabinet Secretary. Yes, that has delayed our work in a Section 5 order. Initially, when we carried out the consultation, and the PAPL's committee was also undertaking its post-legislative scrutiny, so we planned to inform our work going forward in line with the consultation as well. Now, that report itself was delayed because of the outbreak, and since we have retrenched to focus on supporting case handlers, we have halted the further consultation that would be required to introduce a Section 5 order. When you introduce a Section 5 order, you must consult all the bodies that are likely to be impacted by that order. And obviously, if, for example, we were looking at private sector care homes, this is probably not a time where they're going to be very receptive to a consultation on further extension of FOISA. We will return to that as soon as we can, but it's just not been possible in the interim.
Thank you, Jerry, for that explanation of some of the operational challenges. But if I can stick with the issue of transparency and care homes, I'd like to turn to the issue of reporting on care homes in the 2 monthly report to Parliament. And it's welcome to see some analysis of the new Care Inspectorate fortnightly reports, which I have put forward as amendments. I think it's been good for MSPs and the public to access the report. But when we have queries about individual care homes in our own parliamentary areas, we can't really access information unless it's in that general report by the Care Inspectorate, and only if they've happened to visit that home in the previous 2 weeks. So I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary could say something about what more could be done, perhaps through regulations or other means, to give Parliament more information on individual care homes.
Well, I think many MSPs who have that issue within their area, and I have that issue within my own area and was dealing with it only this week, need to develop a relationship with the Health and Social Care Partnership, for example, that allows information to be provided, and also to develop a relationship with the care home so that one understands what is taking place. I don't think anybody would doubt that, as Jerry has said, proceeding with a Section 5 order at this particular stage would simply not be possible, given the difficulties that exist. That's not to say that it shouldn't be possible at some stage in the future. I think MSPs will be able to obtain information if they do so through the Health and Social Care Partnership, if they do so through the Care Inspectorate, and of course they are able to ask questions of the Scottish Government in terms of what the Scottish Government would know about any individual care home. All those are avenues that could.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. All those routes are very familiar, but I think it's fair to say that the information and the way it's cascaded is still quite patchy, but that's something we can return to in other forums, perhaps. Just a final question, Convener, from me then, is on the Social Care Staff Support Fund, which I know from the report became operational on the 24th of June, which again is very welcome. Can I ask if subsequent reports will contain further information about the operation and use of the funds, as well as how long it will operate for? I've had some care workers and unions express concerns that there might be an expiry date or it might be time limited, and some people are experiencing some barriers, which is not really a matter for the Cabinet Secretary to address now, but just to get a general feel for how well that is going, and if that's something that we would hope to see for the duration of the pandemic, as long as we need it.
That was a commitment in the legislation. But I am very open to suggestions about what future reports should contain, and I'm very grateful to the team that works on these for being so thoughtful and determined to make sure that the reports provide the maximum amount of information. And indeed, as I've indicated in my opening remarks, there are bits in this report in which we've drilled down even deeper into some issues because we recognise the interest and concerns that existed arising out of the first report. So I can tell Monica Lennon that I have noted, and more importantly, I'm sure my team have noted, what she has said about reporting on the fund, and we'll take that away and look at that in terms of the next report, which these are remorseless. These reports that you've just done one and another one comes along. The next reporting period is actually until the 30th of September. So once we have sorted that out, and I think we've now working on a provisional date for the report to be issued, then we'll bear that in mind, and if we can do a bit more in that one, then providing the legislation is renewed, and we hope it will be, then in those circumstances there will be at least 3 more reports, so we can do more work on those.
Thank you for that. Can I turn next, please, to Stuart Stevenson?
Thank you very much, Convener. I've got a very tiny follow-up to Donald Cameron's questions that he had on data collection. I would have asked what he asked. And it's just very simply whether the government might consider putting a time limit on how long data may be held by hospitality and other sectors who have to gather it. There is a minimum level of 21 days. I just wonder if it might give more confidence. However, let me move on to something of a wee bit more substance, but not enormous. On Regulations 12, the second of the 2 regulations before us, I just wonder whether we've got information about the effects on the spread of the disease that we're currently experiencing from outdoor events. We've got a general exemption for organised outdoor activity that exempts them from public gathering restrictions. But I just wonder where we are with understanding what the effects of allowing that to happen are. Convener.
In terms of the 21 days, the regulations specify data should be held for a 21-day retention period before being securely disposed of. So, I mean, that is absolutely clear. And the 21-day period will ensure the full cover of the typical incubation period and additional time during which people may be infectious. So I wouldn't expect, and indeed would not encourage people to keep that data in the long term, but 21 days is specified. In terms of outdoor events, no, I have to say that it's not something I've heard considerable discussion about. I think there is an expectation that outdoors is certainly much less concerning on the spread of the virus. I mean, we see that, for example, in the Glasgow situation at the present moment, where the evidence is about indoor transmission in households, not outdoor transmission. So it's indoor activity that is being ceased. Similarly, indoor visiting for care homes and hospitals is the issue. So I think, as far as outdoors is concerned, then there is less concern. That is not to say that we would wish to encourage very large-scale events, and those are still, of course, not permitted. And we would want to make sure that there was full social distancing and that people were observing social distancing out of doors. But in general terms, if you can do it outdoors, do it outdoors.
No further questions from you, Stuart, is that correct?
No, correct.
Thank you. Can I turn now to Liam MacArthur? Before you ask your question, Liam, can I ask you to declare any relevant interests, please?
Thank you, Convener. I have no registrable interests relevant to the work of this.
Please go ahead.
Thanks very much, and congratulations on your appointment. I was going to follow similar line of questioning to yourself, Convener, and Stuart Stevenson. So let me maybe develop that a little further. There's certainly concerns being raised with me about the slightly broad brush approach taken in relation to hospitality, and that the distancing that can be sort of safely enforced and achieved in, for example, restaurants and cafes That's very different from that in pubs, and certainly at a local level, I've had a number of local restaurants and cafes anxious that perhaps either the behaviour of those running pubs or behaviour of individuals in those pubs may put at risk other businesses in the wider hospitality sector. And I wondered what work that the government had done in terms of segmenting the different types of businesses within that sector.
I think that's a good question, and of course it is one that we all are faced with from constituents who may be in one part of a tourism or other sector and believe that they are able to operate very successfully and don't understand why they're not permitted to operate because they believe the danger lies in another part of the sector. I think there are two issues in there. One is, we have to judge this on the basis of what we know, and we do know that if you don't observe social distancing, then the risk of transmission is greatly increased. We have stuck with the 2 meters because we believe that that is the right minimum, but that has been lessened in the hospitality trade and of course in film and television, but very, very clearly there are other precautions that people are being asked to place. We're also very clear that part of the mitigation is also making sure that you wear face coverings. So the wearing of face coverings in a huge range of activities is encouraged and indeed now mandated. I could go through the full list, but it would take some time. But any premises which is open to members of the public are used for retail sale, hire of goods and services, shops, takeaway restaurants, estate agents, beauty parlours. It doesn't include bars and pubs or certain hospitality premises with table service, because we recognise that that is impossible to do. But there are other precautions we're asking people to put in place. I know there's been some complaint about music. And the fact that music should continue to be played in these premises. But actually, what you're trying to do is to discourage people from being to each other. So as far as the regulations are concerned, it has to be broad brush, but it also has to be broad brush for understanding the regulation. If you get into real detail of saying, this tiny subsection is fine, but that other tiny subsection aren't, there will be confusion, there will be lack of observation. And one of the things I am very conscious of at this committee, having been here, I'm now on the 9th occasion talking about amendments to regulations, is that I'm desperately keen that this isn't too complicated and that people understand what they do have to do. And that has to be a simple message. So when we've got face coverings, we're saying they have to be worn, and they have to be worn in all these circumstances and should be worn. And 2 meters is the rule, and it should be the rule everywhere. And there are very, very few exceptions to that. Now, this is tough, and it's tough for businesses, and I accept there are many businesses who find this very difficult. But I think that the only way to a secure long-term recovery is to make sure that we are able to move on from where we are now. And to do that, we have to do, well, to be fair, we have to do better than we're doing presently, because we've still got problems.
For that, you talked earlier, Cabinet Secretary, about obviously the responsibilities now on the owners of pubs and restaurants to gather data on their clientele. Flipping that round in terms of what they in turn can expect, I wondered whether there were any lessons drawn from the experience in Aberdeen, where I know quite a number of the pub owners who found their premises named in the list that was published, expressing frustration and anger that the first they knew of that was on the publication of the details of their businesses. What's your understanding of what businesses can expect where there is an outbreak, where the government or the authorities need to publish information about their rights in terms of being informed in the first instance, not least perhaps in terms of managing the relationship they have with their own customers?
And nobody is stigmatizing any premises or organisation, but this is balancing the needs of the businesses with the public health needs that exist and the needs to suppress the virus. And if the information can only be provided to public health officials, to contact tracers essentially, so that information is privileged and is solely for a purpose. But if individuals have been to those premises and they need to find others who've been to those premises and those records were incomplete, and remember, I think in Aberdeen we're dealing quite often with circumstances before it was mandatory, and certainly before there was regulation underpinning it. In those circumstances, if there is no keeping of clear records, then you need to be able to say, if people were in these premises, then they should contact the health services. I would have hoped, and I'm sure it is true, that there is a sensitivity to business needs and a sensitivity to public health needs, and those involved are balancing all the time. But in the end, it will be the public health need that will have to triumph if there is a choice between them. And that will mean saying, we need to know who was here. Now, what we're doing with these regulations, and I hope creating the circumstances where that is automatic, we will know who was there because we have a complete and comprehensive list of all the customers. And that is now mandatory. And that is what the regulations now say has to happen. And that will help premises in the end.
I mean, I absolutely accept the primacy of the public health need. I suppose the anxiety has been expressed in relation to Aberdeen. I don't think cut across that at all. I think it was, in a sense, if you were the owner of a premises that has been caught up in this, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that you would be contacted ahead of information then being put in the public domain, quite rightly for the reasons that you've suggested. Yeah. Just lastly, in terms of, you indicated in your opening remarks, Cabinet Secretary, about a number of powers that had not yet been commenced, others that had been commenced but hadn't yet been put into practice, presumably because the need has not yet arisen. I was just wondering whether or not you could exemplify that in terms of those instances, and whether or not we should be expecting some of those that may have been commenced but not yet put into practice to be put into practice in the coming days or weeks.
But it's an important issue, and it's a complex issue because now we're dealing with a range of powers, and a very wide range of powers in both the LCM, the UK Act, and in the two Scottish Acts, which we are then now looking at and saying which of those have been used, and we can go through them and say which have been used and which haven't been used, which of those haven't been used and we might still need, and which of those do we think we no longer need, and then just to add a slight complication to those complications, are there any which we might need, which we want to hold on to, but we will just suspend them for the period of time so we can do that. And we have categorized those. I'm happy, the report categorizes them, and the report lists in some detail each of those that are there. And now we are looking at them in terms of what we need to do next. Just in terms of ones that we've been using and not been using. If you look, for example, at the emergency registration of nurses and healthcare professionals, we needed that. That was something that needed to happen. And therefore we went out and did it. That was out of the UK Coronavirus Act. So that was something we needed to take place. It was a power we needed to have. We needed to have the emergency arrangements for medical practitioners. We needed to have the temporary registration of social workers. All those things we were putting into place. But there were some that we actually decided, they just haven't been used. For example, again, going to the UK legislation, the temporary modification of mental health legislation, which has been a controversial one. That's not been used. But it's not going to be wound back in because it may be used, but it hasn't been used. So I think the report indicates in each area what has been used and what hasn't been used. And we will indicate, we have indicated with the secondary legislation laid, those ones that we wish not to continue with, those that will be essentially taken out of the renewal when that comes, providing the Parliament agrees to that, and two instances of ones that we want to suspend. And the reasons for those are clear too within the secondary legislation.
Thank you for that. Can I turn next, please, to Annabel Ewing?
Thank you, Convener. Returning to the issue of the regulations number 11 and the collection of contact details of customers on the part of those premises providing hospitality. A constituent raised with me, raised, I have to say, also the data retention issues that have already been addressed. So it would be helpful to receive this further clarity about the impact of the GDPR as regards this provision. And it also is useful to hear from the Cabinet Secretary to remind us that the data is to be securely disposed of after 21 days. But of course, it's what the collector can do in the interim, I suppose, that remains the issue. But this constituent raised with me the scenario where a provider of hospitality offers only the option of a smartphone app approach to collection of data, and the person concerned, the customer, doesn't have a smartphone. I mean, presumably they should also be offering alternatives like pen and paper, albeit, of course, the pen issue raises issues about the sanitising of the pen and so forth. But presumably that should be also an option. And another constituent has raised with me a different issue, which is if they go somewhere and they see that actually this now regulation is not being complied with, who do they report that to? Is it the local authority? Is it the police? Perhaps the Cabinet Secretary could clarify those two issues. Thank you.
Well, they report it to the police, and it would do no harm to report it to a local authority as well. But both required to have a jurisdiction in this matter, and the police particularly. There is a fine, for not doing so, and that really should be. And this is really important. This isn't an optional extra. This is really important in terms of test and protect that information is recorded. The regulations do not mandate how it should be recorded, nor should they. So, if any business is saying we can only do this on a certain type of smartphone or whatever, that's not possible. They should do it in a way that they have an ability to find the key person. It relates to, if it's a group of two people, household or whatever, it relates to the key person, and they should be able to make sure that they can find that. And this is, let's always go back to the purpose. Let's go back to the primary source. The primary purpose of this is to make sure that if when somebody they're tracing the contacts of an individual, they're able to trace those contacts wherever that individual has been, on licensed premises, in a restaurant, whatever. That is really important, just as they can trace them in households and elsewhere. And that's why it's being recorded. And in terms of misuse of the data, the regulation is very clear. There is only one legitimate use of this data, and that is for the provision of that data to public health officials. There is no other legitimate use of this data. And therefore, that should be absolutely clear. I don't know if Rebecca would want to add anything to that, but I think it's pretty clear what the situation is.
Rebecca White, would you like to add anything to what we've just discussed?
Just to say, as the Cabinet Secretary said, there is a fine associated with not following the restrictions set out in the regulations. I'd also want to highlight perhaps even more the role of local authority, environmental health officers and other professionals in monitoring particularly the business aspects of the regulations. And as far as I understand it, they are following up any reports that they receive from members of the public about non-compliance. So if constituents are particularly concerned about an individual premises, as the Cabinet Secretary has said, local authorities now have additional powers around compliance for individual premises. So if there's a particular problem in a particular location, then they can take action to remedy that. So just to emphasise that there are different routes that a concerned constituent could take in relation to premises that appear not to be following the system properly.
On a wider issue, the Cabinet Secretary in his opening statement referred to proposals to extend the emergency underlying legislation, or many provisions of it, to 31 March 2021. On that basis, is there any expectation at all that we could be moving to phase 4 of the route map anytime soon?
The First Minister has made it clear that the phase we're in, phase 3, is expected to last for some time. I don't think I can be any more specific than that. We entered phase 3, I think, on the 9th of July. We're still in phase 3. I would not anticipate us moving on to another phase. Remember, that phase 4 means the virus has been suppressed and isn't a public health emergency, and we're not at that stage. Absolutely, obviously, we're not at that stage. So my expectation is that that is not something that is, if I may put it this way, imminent.
you, Convener.
Thank you. Can I turn next, please, to Maurice Corrie?
And also, my congratulations to you on being elected as convener of this committee. Well done. Could I ask the Cabinet Secretary what proactive checks are being made on venues to ensure that the gathered information is being used and stored correctly and conforming to GDPR? It is slightly following on from Annabel Ewing's question, but in more specific, because I think proactive approach needs to be put in place to ensure that we are not seeing this information misused, Cabinet Secretary.
Mr. Corrie, you're a former local authority councillor. You know that that local authorities do not have unlimited resources to inspect premises, even if they wish to do so. When in their guideline review, that's undoubtedly true, as you also know. So I wouldn't expect local authorities to be, in every licensed premises every week or every day, but I would expect them to be proactive. And I have regular conversations in my own area with the council chief executive, and I know other people do. I would expect them to be vigilant. I would expect them to be helpful and to respond to requests for information, to be attentive to members of the public who are concerned about this happening, and members of the public have a role here. As citizens, we all have a role to make sure that these regulations on coronavirus are observed, and it's for our own good that they exist, and we want to make sure that they are effective. So the period we're going through does not last a moment longer than it has to. So I'd expect everybody to play their role in this, just as I expect the police to play their role. And, the police have been very, very good, in terms of the 4Es approach for all the enforcement. But these regulations, there would be no reason why they could not be observed and could not be observed properly, given the amount of support, help and guidance that exists to ensure that premises can do so. And I think that message also needs to get out to licensed premises. These are not optional.
Cabinet Secretary, can I follow on this question? Therefore, the emphasis is on the local authorities to implement this or be proactive about it. What provision has the Scottish Government made under the COVID regulations to provide extra funding for the extra vigilance that the EHOs of councils have got to put these checks into place and be more proactive?
Well, I think that there is a continuing dialogue about local authority funding, as you're aware. There has been a dialogue about local authority funding since local authorities existed, and probably before. And that dialogue will continue on these issues, and I'm quite sure that local authorities, if they need additional resource and help, will want to make that point. Environmental health officers, for example, are under enormous pressure too, with the much unwanted Brexit process and the additional inspections of seafood, for example. So there are big pressures, and we will do our best to help with the pressures for which we are responsible. I hope others will help with the pressures for which they are responsible.
Thank you. Convener, can I ask one more question on FOI?
Absolutely, please go ahead.
Thank you, Convener. This is for Mr. Hendricks. Mr. Hendricks, what plans are in place for continuous training of your FOI staff in the Scottish Government?
As I mentioned earlier, what we have done so far, as part of the intervention with the Commissioner, we trained almost 300 case handlers to deal with FOI requests. As I noted, some of them have moved on to deal with COVID work in the meantime. What we have done is we have run 2 test events with staff in our health directorates to take them through case handling, to take them through each step required in dealing with an FOI request. We've taken some feedback from the people on that, and we plan to roll that out to staff more widely in the coming months. So that's our initial step to take us through the current situation. Once we get back to some kind of normality, we will look to reinstate, all of the measures that we had brought into place with our improvement project and take that forward again.
Thank you for that. The next set of questions comes from Alison Johnson. Alison, before you ask your questions, can I also invite you to declare any relevant interests, please?
I have no relevant interest to declare, Convener, and congratulations on your convenership.
Thank you.
I would like to ask the Cabinet Secretary, the list of exempt countries is changing frequently for wholly understandable reasons, and at the same time we're expecting the ongoing arrival of international students to Scotland and the UK more widely. And I'd just like to understand if there's any discussion ongoing within government about the potential testing on disembarking of such students.
Thank you for the question. The guidance on universities and the resumption of universities was, I think, published yesterday. I think I would have to undertake to send the member that guidance if she hasn't seen it already, because I don't have it to hand here. But I know that that guidance was published, and I know, for example, that the reliance on quarantine was one part of that guidance for international students. The guidance is in detail. I know the universities and colleges have been deeply involved in drawing up that guidance. So I think the best thing we could probably do is make sure that you have that guidance. And of course, the minister responsible for that guidance would be, I think, Richard Lockhead, who the committee might want to talk to once they've examined it.
Okay, I appreciate that, Cabinet Secretary. With regard to the current situation in Glasgow and the West, the transmission of the virus within small household groups, do you feel that issue is being aired to the extent that it should be? Is there an understanding amongst the general public that small household groups can be an issue? Is there enough focus on that, or is it still felt that only large groups are an issue?
Well, I think the issue will be clear to the people of Western Barton and East Renfrew and Glasgow today that is, in the view of the epidemiologists, the significant cause of the clusters and the rate of infection that appears to have built in recent days and is being addressed, and the measures being taken are because of that. So I think that is being driven home. I hope also is being driven home the irresponsibility of larger groups, whether they are younger people or older people, meeting together. We can see that worldwide. This is, as I've said before at this committee, this is a constantly changing set of circumstances, and it is necessary to change and adapt to them. That is why we are talking about 13 sets of amendments to regulations, and they're still coming. We've had to be fleet of foot. We've had to look at different circumstances. The announcement yesterday, and no doubt the First Minister will talk about it today, there was consideration given to the role of pubs, for example, and some people, of course, have been commenting and saying, why am I not allowed to meet indoors, but I can go to a pub? Well, there are different regulations and there are different precautions in place in pubs which are externally verified. It is very hard to have precautions externally verified and observed if people are meeting in each other's houses. That is a very different set of circumstances. And I think, therefore, it is important to bring home to people how important it is, because you can't act on it in the way that you could act with pubs or restaurants. So you have to bring it home to people. The more we do that, I think, the better. And I think asking this question is a helpful part of that, so that we can discuss and debate it.
Earlier on in your evidence this morning, you spoke about the need for simple public health messaging, which is clear and easy to understand, and I absolutely appreciate that. We do, however, have constituents writing to us. The committee has received correspondence on the issue, for example, of why swimming pools were closed for a specific length of time. Views from constituents and from others who are perhaps just below that elite level of competitor, but still taking part in performance squads and so on, who feel that they were perhaps treated as a general swimmer or a recreational swimmer. So I think there's a tension there between the need for that simple, clear messaging and absolute transparency as to how these decisions were reached. And the Minister for Public Health, explained that the framework for decision making was responsible for the way that decision was arrived at, but sometimes it doesn't help people fully understand. Is there anything that we can do to help ensure that people really understand why decisions have been taken?
Difficult, because there's a matrix of decision making, and it's not as simple as putting, this concern and activity in one place and another one next to it and saying, why can we do one and not the other? We need to understand two things. One is, as I've indicated, for example, the difference between pubs and private households is, in addition to other differences, the level of external verification and regulation that you can undertake to check on something, whereas you can't do it in another place. But also, the way in which it's cumulative needs to be understood. The objective is to keep the number of infections as low as possible, stop community transmission of the virus. But it's not a simple matter to say that one activity will increase by that amount. You've got to look at a mix of activities of things that we have already done, for example, and whether by adding something else to it you would make that worse, or what has in actual fact we've already done already been absorbed into the system, and therefore we could add something else to it. So it's not just as simple as saying this is the outcome. It's a cumulative outcome. It's the mix of outcomes. It's the level of regulation, and that is frustrating in terms of its complexity. And how you then boil that down into simple messages, but do's and don'ts, and people have confidence in those messages is a key issue. One of them is transparency. I think at this committee I've quoted before a book on the 1918 Spanish flu, by an American scholar who comes to the conclusion that, and it's very much worth reading, at the end of the day, that those who dealt best with it a century ago did so on the basis of transparency and transparent government, and those who dealt worst with it were those who actually did not see the importance of good governance in these matters. And I think that is a very important lesson, but it is not easy to do, and particularly when you are dealing with the complexities of modern legislation. We all have to do our best at it, and this is part of it. But we also have to ask people sometimes to trust us that we've thought this through very, very carefully. I know in swimming pools, I had a number of swimming pools in my own constituency, who were very concerned. Like a community pool in Loch Gilphead, for example, who do absolutely fantastic work, and were very, very concerned that they couldn't open. I'm delighted that they are now open. But it was part of the balance of risk that we were looking at, not just the fact that the people who run that pool would have done everything to the letter. It was a balance of risk across society.
Very much appreciate that response, and I do appreciate the efforts the Scottish Government have made to update people on a regular basis. But yeah, I think just ensuring that transparency and communication is made very much a focal point would be really important to continuing to tackle the pandemic. Thank you. No more questions, Convener.
Thank you for that. Can I turn next to Shona Robertson, please?
Good morning, and can I add my welcome to you as a new convener? I want to turn to an issue, Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned in your opening remarks, and that's about information about domestic abuse. As you know, both of the Acts requires or puts a number of requirements on Scottish ministers. One, to take account of any information about the nature and number of incidents, and then Scottish ministers are also required to explain in the report how the information was taken account of. I guess my first question is really what, if you're able to tell us, what positive impact all of this and these requirements put on Scottish ministers has had for victims of domestic abuse. We did touch on this briefly with the Chief Constable at the Justice Committee, but it would be helpful to get your view of what overall has this meant for those who have been, I guess, very much a concern for us all during lockdown, but also in the as we come out of lockdown and restrictions are eased.
Well, I think there are two things I should say. First is the figure indicates a rise in incidents of domestic. The figures that we've got in the report were April to June, and there appeared to be a rise of possibly 9%. It's difficult to know because there are different figures saying different things. We see this in July. There's appears to be in July. We've just had these statistics, so we can now talk about them. Incidents appear again to be about 9% higher. So there clearly has been, very regrettably, a rise in domestic abuse. Question then is what can be done, what is being done, and I think the chief executive, the chief constable indicated, amongst other things, the focus of the police force on this, and I've talked to senior police officers too, who've indicated that being aware of that is the first step to, in actual fact, then acting upon it. There's also been messaging on those issues, and there's also been, I think, support provided to agencies which deal with domestic abuse. But I think probably we need to move on from that now, and now that we can see what the figures are, then it will be up to ministers who address this, particularly justice ministers, to bring forward further action that they think is required, and I hope they will do so.
Just to follow up on that then, so what you're saying is ministers are actively discussing and continue to discuss what more needs to be done, because I guess one of my concerns is that, as we've seen from the west of Scotland, there may be further restrictions imposed, and the sense that the more domestic abuse victims are hidden, and that is clearly a deep concern for us all, and the rise in figures you've highlighted is hugely concerning. So, are you able to give a flavour, or indeed give a commitment to come right back to the committee once some of those further actions are agreed? I think certainly I would like to see more information on that. And is there a role for us, I guess, as MSPs within our own constituencies to be trying to promote information and help to people in a variety of ways that we can kind of amplify the message that government's trying to put out and agencies are trying to put out?
For members of the Scottish Parliament to be active in these matters. What I can do also is ask my colleagues in the Justice portfolio to look at what you have said and to make sure they come back to you and to the committee with the information that you're looking for, in terms of not just having honoured the first part of the commitment we made in terms of getting the information, but honouring the second part, what that information leads to. And I'm happy to ask them to do so.
Thank you. Sian, is that all the questions you wish to ask?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Can I turn finally to Willie Coffey, please?
Thanks, Convener, and welcome to the committee, of course. Cabinet Secretary, I'm hoping to ask just a couple of questions, mainly for clarification from a number of issues that have been happening in my constituency. The first one is about the regulation about protecting tenancies, protection of tenancies. I'm hearing that some people who rent a property are being given notice by their landlords to quit, and it's nothing to do with rent arrears or antisocial behaviour, anything like that. Could you clarify if the regulation, 6-month regulation, is actually enforced and covers all circumstances where a landlord would wish to remove a tenant from a property?
Evictions that would not be connected, for example, to antisocial behaviour. We have to recognise that there will be, very regrettably, still people who are guilty of antisocial behaviour who frankly make their neighbours' lives hell. And we shouldn't be, in the end, allowing that to take place. But nobody should be threatened with eviction or have the threat of eviction hanging over them because they are unable to pay the rent. And coronavirus clearly is a major circumstance. So the 6 month period has been extended, but added to with a range of other provisions. There's a new Hardship Fund, for example, that has been set up, and the Housing Minister made a series of announcements, I think, yesterday, connected to what the proposals are. We can't vary we can't actually vary the details of the renewal. We can only renew or not renew or suspend. but he has brought forward additional things which will be part of the process. But yeah, there shouldn't be evictions at this stage for people who are unable to pay the rent, and coronavirus is clearly so serious that we don't want people to be homeless as a result of it.
Just let me clarify, these are people who are paying the rent. There are no unusual circumstances, but they're being given 6 weeks notice to quit.
That issue as a constituency issue with the Housing Minister as a matter of urgency. And of course, I'm sure he will respond.
Other question is, unfortunately in Ayrshire we're hearing reports of a person who may have willfully and knowingly gone out into the community when they had the virus and has potentially been the cause of spreading this and causing what the Ayrshire media are calling a super cluster. What powers do we have to deal with any individual who willfully and flagrantly abuses the advice and guidance given and continues to go out into the community knowing that they may have or indeed have the virus?
The police have the power to detain that individual and to return him to his home premises. I mean, that his or her. I'm not familiar with the case. Home premises. There's no doubt about that. And I'm sure they would also consider other issues such as whether it was a malicious act. I think the Lord Advocate indicated very early on that people who, for example, spat at police officers and said that they had coronavirus would be treated very severely indeed. I would have thought that the police and the public health authorities would want to make sure that if somebody who was floating, then the absolute requirement to isolate if they have the virus could not be treated with equanimity, and that would have to be seen as a serious.
Okay. Last question, Convener, to the Cabinet Secretary. It's about the wedding industry. I know the current restriction is for 20 persons, I think, to be able to attend a wedding, but when you take into account the likely size of a wedding party, it could be up to 10, for example, which leaves a very small number of guests possible, Cabinet Secretary. Is there any thinking to perhaps extend that even by a little amount to particularly help the industry that supports the wedding industry, like bulk hire and so on and so forth? And is it even possible that people wishing to proceed with a wedding could have tests in advance to give some assurance that the numbers of people attending such an event were safe to do so?
I know how upsetting and annoying this is, and I really do regret that it exists. On the positive side, the First Minister said that she'll keep this under review, and it continues to be under review. And I know that the wedding trade is in discussion, with the authorities about how they might go about expanding what they do. But it is important to recognise that it is a pretty ideal set of circumstances for the virus to spread. It is difficult at weddings and at other events, big events, and funerals are also, and wakes are also an example of that, where people are emotional and people are, it is difficult to enforce social distancing. In a pub or a restaurant, you can sort of do it. It's harder to do it at a party or whatever. It just isn't wise at this present stage to add that difficulty to the range of difficulties that exist. But it is being kept under review, and nobody wants it to be so. It is. We've gone through a whole range of issues, gyms, swimming pools, those, but people feel badly done to, and they do feel that they should be allowed to do what they want to do, and I can fully understand that. And as individual members will receive that from people, it's not. These decisions aren't taken lightly or in an ill-considered fashion, and they are kept constantly under review. But there is a very strong fear that they will add to what is already, as we see from the situation in Glasgow and the west of Scotland today, a very fragile set of circumstances. And I think it is wiser not to take risks.
Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary. Thanks, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all my colleagues, and can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his evidence this morning and the evidence given by his officials. I should just say that we have been contacted by the official report to say that they're missing the first couple of words of each question and answer. And although we've now finished the questions, just a sort of quick reminder to everybody to pause for a few seconds before asking a question or giving an answer would be greatly appreciated. We will now move on to the next agenda item. That's agenda item 4, subordinate legislation, and that is to take consideration of the motions on the subordinate legislation that we have taken evidence on just now. Are members content for motions S5M 22427 and S5M 22517 to be moved en bloc? If any member is not content with this approach, please can you type N in the chat bar now? It seems that members are agreed to move the motions en bloc. So can I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to move en bloc motion S5M 22427 that the COVID-19 Committee recommends that the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Scotland Amendment Number 11 Regulations 2020 SSI 2020/241 be approved, and motion S5M 22517 that the COVID-19 Committee recommends that the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Scotland Amendment Number 12 Regulations SSI 2020/251 be approved.
Moved en bloc, Convener.
Does any member wish to speak on the motion? If so, could you please indicate this by typing R in the chat bar? So it appears that no member wishes to speak, so I will now put the question on the motions. The question is that motions S5M 22427 and motion S5M 22517 be agreed to. Does any member disagree? And if you do disagree, please can you type N in the chat bar now? The motions are agreed to. Can I again thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for attending the meeting this morning. The committee will publish a report to the Parliament setting out our decision on the statutory instruments in the coming days. That concludes our business for this meeting, and I now close the meeting. Thank you.